And right now, I'll be introducing the next session, which is called, revolves around the Me Too movement from the US to the rest of the world. I'd like to welcome on stage Diana Pierce-Burgess, who's the co-founder of Press Forward and who will be moderating this session, together with Rana Ayyub, who's an investigative journalist and a columnist, Fatemah Farag from Walab Ebalad Media, and Julie Posetti from the Oxford University.
So I wanted to get started quickly. We first want to thank Bertrand and others for allowing us this platform. Incredibly grateful and honored to be here, especially after meeting my fellow panelists, and who I'm going to introduce in a moment, but also seeing the awards last night and some of the winners and the nominees, the courage of some of the journalists and the work that they're doing. It's incredibly impressive. So Me Too, hashtag Me Too, and the US and the impact around the world. First, let's be clear. This is not a gender issue. This is a human rights issue. It is not only about sexual harassment, it is a problem regarding abuse of power. And it is also a public health issue. The mental and physical and psychological toll it takes on the victims is not to be ignored. And lest anyone think that these stories you hear are overinflated, all you need to do is hear the harrowing and difficult story from Rana here on our panel in a few minutes to understand the reality. It's alive and well in our society today. So what are we going to do about it? What has the impact been from Me Too? Where I live in the US and the UK, I feel like we're at a watershed moment. The collective women's voices have had the courage to rise up and say, enough. But this didn't happen overnight. I believe it's been a slow burn, simmering in society, and over time it has bubbled up to the surface. It's finally erupted. My organization, Press Forward, is as an initiative dedicated to creating safe and fair newsrooms to elevate women in the workplace. We're looking for solutions, both short-term and long-term. We have 5 initiatives on our website. You can go check them out. But we were born out of Me Too. Our 12 co-founders, including myself, were all impacted by sexual harassment at the hands of powerful journalists in the US. But we were not content to allow the movement to wane without seeking solutions. As a society, we are now at this moment because of the courage of those who told their stories. The world is now watching to see how news organizations will respond. News organizations are supposed to give a voice to the voiceless. Will they do so within their own communities? We need the press to succeed now more than ever. I believe a healthy newsroom, with a healthy newsroom comes a healthy democracy. We need to redefine respect. We must allow women and men a safe and fair environment to do their best work as journalists, as equals. But the promise of change doesn't necessarily translate to lasting change, so we need to do this right, find effective solutions, and in order to do that, we need to study the problems, examining all the systems that have failed us. And that brings me to my panel. This group of women here are seasoned journalists who have either experienced these issues firsthand, studied them or researched them, or reported on them, or all of the above. I'd like to start with introducing Fatemah Farag. She is the founder and director of Welbalad Media Limited, a company dedicated to community media development and media experience in Egypt. She is also the MENA director for Wan Ifra's Women in News program, a World Editors Forum board member, and a Nieman Fellow. Julie Posetti is a newly appointed senior research fellow at Oxford University and an award-winning Australian journalist and academic. At Oxford's Reuters Center for the Study of Journalism, she will lead the Institute's New Journalism Innovation Project. She is also the author of Protecting Journalism Sources in a Digital Age, vitally important to today's topic, and we'll get to that, which is a major UN study covering 121 countries, published by UNESCO in 2017. And we also have Rana Ayyub, an prominent investigative journalist and columnist from India, and a vital voice in South Asia, covering politics and social issues, justice and state crimes. Among her many achievements is her breakthrough investigation in extrajudicial murders, which sent the first serving Home Minister and one of the most important politicians of India behind bars. And she is also has been undercover for 8 months in an investigative sting operation on the current Prime Minister Modi. She has many awards and recognitions for her intrepid, tenacious, and crucially important investigative reporting, but it has not come without a price. So I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I'd like to start with Fatemah to give us your assessment of what is happening within newsrooms in your part of the world. Tell us what you've seen in terms of inequalities, harassment, abuse of power, both before Me Too and after, and has there been any difference?
Thank you, Diane. Good afternoon. What Me Too has done is it's created a sort of a global context for the discussion of what are traditionally very taboo topics within conservative societies. So it makes it possible for someone like me, an Arab journalist, to be able to sit here at this panel and comfortably discuss issues of sexual harassment within newsrooms in the MENA region, because it is not something that is specific necessarily to my part of the world, but it is a global problem, and we sit equally here trying to find solutions to it, and that is very empowering context to the discussion. Having said that, if you look into the Arab world and other parts of the world, you will find it difficult to see the same type of momentum and outcry as we've seen in the US and in parts of the West. And that is obviously because these are more conservative societies. It is very, very difficult for women to come forward. They pay the price. Not only do they pay the price personally and professionally, but also their families. It has long-term implications with regards to if you're married, if you stay married, if you want to get married, if you will ever be able to get married, your children at school, your next job. So there are very high price to coming forward, and it's been difficult, I think, for women to find the context which makes them comfortable to do so within MENA. And that's something we can talk about a bit further, how to redress and deal with that. There's also the consideration that we have this saying in Arabic, when we're trying to say that women are really a good force within the market, a woman is equal to 100 men. So what is this? This is the benchmark has become the man, and it's not good enough to be equal to a man. You have to be as good as 100, really, to be able to prove yourself. And women are always struggling within the newsroom to prove that they can do the job equally and better, and they actually have to be better if they're going to get anywhere. And when you have that kind of a working environment, it becomes difficult for women to come up and say, but we are vulnerable because we are women, and we have to face sexual harassment. You don't hear men complaining about it, so professional women shouldn't either. And so working to that standard, working within that context where you have to prove that you are a man times 100, also puts constraints on the ability of women to be able to come forward and say that they are vulnerable. And if you do come forward and say so, then there is always, of course, the gods of patriarchy that will come down to protect you. And many well-meaning men, media managers, their response to this will be, let's protect the women in the newsroom. Let's keep them doing book reviews or sitting in departments where they don't have to go out and face sexual harassment, where they can go home at 3 o'clock, where we don't infringe on those other aspects which define their womanhood. And that is also a double-edged sword, and professional women don't want to be boxed in there. So you stay away from that box by staying away from any implication that you are confronting sexual harassment. The final thing I'll say about this, which makes all of this, and you'll see hints of this in other parts of the world, it's not necessarily just in the Arab world, but also what we have is a very highly politicized and polarized media industry. And what this means is that if you come forward with something, it's very, very easy for someone who wants to counter this attack to say that you are doing this not because you are the victim of harassment, but because you are representing an opposing political force. And that is a very high price to pay within the current context of the media industry in the region. So you sort of shy away from that. So that's an added sort of complication to the coming out within the Me Too context.
Interesting. I want to come back to you on a couple of things, but I do want to turn to Julie to tell us about your experiences, both personal and professional, and your assessment of newsrooms in Australia and Asia. And there's a lot to talk about there, so
There is.
go for it.
I started as a journalist in 1989 in Australia, and within the first 12 months, my very first editor was sacked in part for sexually harassing me. I was a radio journalist. I used to have to bend over a desk to compile bulletins in the old school way with text on paper, and he used to like to touch me on the arse as he'd walk by. That was my first experience of recognising as a young feminist that the job had not been done, that we still had an awful lot to do. I had the experience of a very senior Australian politician pretend to choke me after I asked an impertinent question during an interview. I had a high-profile source insist on being interviewed in his hotel room. I am not alone. Me Too is a movement for a reason. Up until that hashtag-driven movement, a lot of these stories remained hidden or within groups of female colleagues because we were too afraid to speak about these experiences lest we be perceived as weak, which is frequently the way women are regarded in news contexts. So we have a situation in Asia, Australasia, which involves not just those sorts of lived experiences, but really excellent investigative journalism triggered by the Me Too movement that has uncovered, for example, the sexpat foreign correspondent phenomenon, which an excellent piece in Foreign Policy recently exposed by, it was by a young foreign correspondent called Joanna Chu, and she pointed out the way in which particularly young Asian vulnerable women, often stringers, are targeted by typically white male foreign correspondents. We also saw in Australia a very high-profile television presenter, I suppose, and entertainer, exposed and brought down. And there's now a project similar to Diana's called Now Australia, which has been crowdfunded, which is designed to confront sexual harassment in the media industry head on. So those are just some examples. In analysing this, though, I think while we have to acknowledge the great power of social media to propel this kind of unity and this kind of activism, we also have to acknowledge that the internet has delivered really serious safety threats to women journalists. So we now confront threats not just in the field as foreign correspondents and local journalists, but increasingly online. And in fact, one of the biggest and newest threats confronting contemporary journalism is the targeted online harassment of women reporters. We are seeing that as a global phenomenon. It has attracted the attention not just of researchers and human rights activists, but also, thankfully, increasingly reporters. And I have to say that based on research and observation and reportage, it is now clear that we can trace a pattern whereby state-sponsored disinformation campaigns are leveraging the harassment of female journalists online as a direct attack on press freedom, as a direct attempt to chill journalism. So with the attacks that we're seeing, we have to note things like doxing and spoofing. So the manipulation of women journalists' images and conversations online to directly expose them to en masse threats of rape, of sexual assault, of murder. And that's something that we as a profession globally have to confront. There are 3 women in this room, one of them is sitting to my right and you'll hear from her in a moment, who have experienced this at the epicentre of gendered online harassment and state-sponsored disinformation campaigns. Maria Ressa in the Philippines, whose own extraordinary investigative journalism with her team at Rappler exposed state-sponsored harassment and disinformation. Ferial Haffajee in South Africa, who also has written about her experiences of being manipulated in this way and having her journalism turned against her as a form of exposure to attack in the context of state capture in South Africa. And I think it's pertinent to point out that this is now an issue being recognised by the UN. I've just co-authored a book with Sherilyn Ireton from the World Editors Forum looking at disinformation and journalism, and I've written a chapter about this very theme where we see women being targeted in the most extreme ways. And Rana, Ayyub here has had the extraordinary experience of seeing 5 special rapporteurs at the UN speak out, issue official statements to defend her in the most difficult circumstances, the most prolific, unprecedented attacks. And I think we probably should hear from Rana.
Yeah, go ahead. We need to hear from you.
Well, I'm here at a very, very difficult time of my journalism career, but I believe it's the right thing to do to speak at this moment right now and to an audience which basically is opinionated, is objective, is audience of journalists. We talk about journalism under strongmen, under Putin, under Erdogan, under Modi, but do we even realize what it is for women journalists to be doing the journalism that we do, women investigative journalists? I mean, across the board, we have trolling, whataboutery, fake news, which has been normalized, and we have seen this more often. I mean, the West has been exposed to this after Trump. I will tell you something that has happened in the last 1 month. Of course, I've been the subject of intense trolling and harassment in India for the last 10 years, but I'll tell you something which has happened in the last month, which has forced 5 UN special rapporteurs to issue a statement to the Indian government to ensure my safety. I'm not sure anything is happening on that front. So on the 20th of April, I was at an award ceremony in India where I spoke about the freedom of press and how freedom of press and speech and of newsrooms is being stifled. A day later, a fake tweet was generated in my name that I support child rapists in the name of Islam. That fake tweet was shared by 1 million people, and the screenshots were circulated. The most well-meaning people send messages to me saying, how dare you say that? We thought you were a well-meaning journalist, a well-meaning person. After that followed a spate of gang rape threats, because if this is what I thought of rape, so let us gang rape you to tell you so that you know what it feels like. I was just about to come to grips with what this feels like when another tweet was generated, a Photoshopped, verified account tweet that said, I hate India and I hate Indians. That tweet was shared 2 lakh times, 200,000 times. And I cannot even tell you the barrage of hatred that it led towards me. You're still about to recover from something like this when a professional contact of mine from the ruling party of India sent me a WhatsApp message saying, I'm going to send you something, but you promised to me that you're not going to be disturbed. Of course, I was disturbed enough, so I said, okay, will you please send it to me? It was a 2-minute, 20-second pornographic video with my image morphed in it. And that was being circulated in hundreds and thousands as me across the board. Within minutes of this person sending me this video, my Twitter timeline was trickling with screenshots of people sending me this video on my Facebook, on my Instagram. It was on everybody's phone, my father's phone, my brother's phone, my neighbors who said, is that you? That very evening, another tweet was generated, a verified tweet that said, I am available. It had my number and my address. What followed after was men sending me images of their naked bodies and asking me for my raid services. There is a regional leader in India, a right-wing leader who's very popular. On his fan page, somebody wrote, look at what we have done to you, Rana Ayyub. Next time you spread hatred against Hindus and Modi, we are going to get worse. That is how brazen it got for me. Anxiety attacks, palpitations followed. As is the case, we are a society, we are a patriarchal society where a great deal is placed on the virtue of a woman. So of course, we live in a society like that. This was done with an agenda. This was done with an agenda to discredit my work. As you see in the West, that mainstream journalists are being discredited. This was done to discredit me as a promiscuous, immoral woman whose word should not be taken as the truth. And by what I saw on social media, a lot of people were accepting that as the truth. And an unfortunate bit was, I, who has been hailed as a brave, fearless journalist, etc., chose to be vulnerable at that point of time. And rightly so. I was vulnerable, I crumbled, and I'm not ashamed of it. Anybody who saw the hate that I witnessed in those 2 weeks would have crumbled, and I'm not ashamed in saying that I crumbled. When I went to the police station, the cop looks at my tweet, the pornographic video, and tells me, where did you first discover this? So I named the location of the place where I first opened the Twitter account. He said, well, the jurisdiction should be of that police station. Can you go to that police station and file the complaint? It took me 2 hours to convince them to file a criminal complaint against people who have been spreading these fake videos, fake tweets in my name. My life has not been the same again. And this kind of hate was also endorsed by the state to an extent, because the people who were spreading these screenshots, and by the end of a week, it was shared 2 million times. The people who were sharing these screenshots and videos were on Twitter, followed by leaders of the mainstream party in India. This was a tacit endorsement. And this has not happened for the first time. Earlier also, in the last 10 years, every time I do a big investigation, because I'm a woman, there are hashtags on Twitter which say, Rana, Ayyub, sex CD. One day, this hashtag runs the entire day with the most obnoxious images of me, my image with a naked body. Yes, the kind of journalism that I do is not something that is palatable to the dispensation. But does that mean you target a woman journalist like this? I don't know what's the way ahead. In an unprecedented, extraordinary move, 5 United Nations Special Rapporteurs have written to the Indian government, and the only response that I have gotten so far from the state and from the people who advocate the idea of the Indian state right now is, why did you have to go to the UN? One, I did not go to the UN. The UN took suo motu cognizance. Because last year, one of my colleagues, Gauri Lankesh, was killed in India. And she was killed a month after she published my book in a regional language. The UN Special Rapporteurs have taken note of that, and they believe that I could be the next target. So I don't know what lies ahead for me, but the story needs to be told, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Rana, it's an incredible story, and thank you so much for sharing this with all of us. I want to ask you, I have so many questions. Have you thought about leaving the country?
In the last 1 month, at least in the last 2 weeks, a lot of these journalism organizations across the board, because when I wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times, followed by a piece which the Washington Post did, and it caused a huge amount of uproar in India and international circuits because something like this was unprecedented. So a lot of these journalism organizations are writing to me to seek exile, to live in another country, but this is what leaders in my country want. They have done this so that I leave the country. They have done it to discredit me. But what these people, especially people who are endorsing this kind of hate on my journalism, do not understand that if I had to be intimidated, if I had to be sexually shamed, I would not be doing the journalism that I've been doing for the last 10 years. I believe in the journalism that I do, and I'm not going to give them the contentment of leaving this country, the country that I belong to, India, which I believe is going through a very difficult time, a phase wherein press freedom is extremely important. There are people in India who look up to me. My leaving the country right now and taking exile somewhere else would be letting the people of my country down who believe in the journalism that I do, so I'm not going to give them the satisfaction of leaving the country. I'll go back to my country. Yes, it's a difficult time, and yes, there is huge international support, and that's something I really need at this point of time. But people in my country, if you're watching, trust me, I'm not going to give you the satisfaction of leaving, so hang in there. Thank you.
I think one of the things that we've discovered with regard to some of these issues is there's so much intersectionality between Rana's story and Julie's and mine. There's so much going on that overlaps. You have sexual harassment, and there's abuse of power, and there's online harassment, there's bullying, there's racial tensions and discrimination, gender, generational age. I mean, it just keeps going. And this is something that I think as journalists, we cover these issues all the time. We need to look inwards at our newsrooms. And what we've discovered with Press Forward is as we keep having these conversations and discussing these issues, we find that the most vulnerable are people who are the youngest in the newsroom. In the US, you have the $20 million man and the $20,000 desk assistant, or you have the interns, or you have freelance journalists, and we all know there's a story several stories in the US about freelancers who were particularly preyed upon with regard to sexual harassment. But these are people that don't have the protections as everybody else does of a huge newsroom behind them and the systems in place. Not to say that those systems or protections helped for some of us over the years, but those are the most vulnerable in our industry, and we need
And I would like to make a small point here, because a lot of journalists, especially here, you have organizational backing. I mean, I left Helka in 2013 after my boss was involved in a sexual harassment case, and I've been an independent journalist. It's more difficult right now for independent journalists, independent investigative journalists, independent women investigative journalists from across the globe who do not have the backing and support. I mean, what has happened, especially the harassment that I've faced, that everybody has issued a statement. That statement does not stop the harassment. I do not want you to see my phone right now. My phone is filled with the most explicitly worded messages and images. So there has to be something cogent, something more. You know, we talk about it, we come at events like this, we talk about how we need to support independent journalists, but what comes, it's only on paper. Independent journalists worldwide are the most vulnerable because they do not have the backing. You do not, I mean, you do not know that we go to a shrink, we take psychiatric care, with the legal help that I am needing right now. I'm taking a lawyer who's taking the case to the court. Independent journalists are vulnerable. So if there's one thing that, you know, instead of sending us to another country in exile, come forward and help independent journalists, ask us what is needed at this point of time.
Yeah.
And I can testify to the fact that her phone is full of harassment as we speak, because as we've been tweeting about what's happening, people have been throwing the harassment, slinging the mud. And it's real. Can I just say that? It's real. It is affecting women in their newsrooms, in the field, in significant ways. This is, you know, emotional abuse, emotional damage, a safety risk that we have to take as seriously as the physical threats to journalists, which we are well and truly aware of. In my last role in industry, which I left at the end of last year, which was as head of digital capability at Fairfax Media in Australia, this is an issue I tried to put on the agenda. And one of the practical responses, I think, if we talk about newsrooms for a moment, is that we can actually link up the safety training that we do in the physical world with the need for more and better digital safety training, defensive tactics, and a recognition that when a woman like Rana or somebody experiencing something that's even less prolific than that, a range of attacks, you need to have strategies in place to manage the impacts. The stress and the psychological damage that is being done to women journalists must be recognised and must be tackled.
Yeah.
And I think the combination of approaches, investigative reportage, commentary, solidarity, campaign journalism on this issue, to echo what Margaret Sullivan said earlier, it's the one issue we have to be activist about, is I think what's needed. And education is a part of that. You know, there's several projects underway to advance gender and media equality, for example, in the EU. We need to globalise that sort of strategy.
Absolutely. And Julie, I want to come back to you on this. So you have done so much work on some of these issues in terms of training programs and guidelines and education, and talk to us a little bit about what you've seen that works or what doesn't work or what has helped in some of these issues?
Well, the Women in News program, it predates metoo, and it's been working on developing better structures within newsrooms to support gender equality and the work of women, especially to promote them into managerial positions and decision-making positions within newsrooms in MENA and in Africa as well. And what we found in the work that we've been doing directly with newsrooms and within the media ecosystems is that there isn't even a clear definition or understanding as to what harassment is. And so when you have this lack of understanding, there's no consensus around what an incident of sexual harassment is, more or less to consider what the proper action would be for a newsroom to take in such a case. And so one of the things that we've been working on is to try and create a common understanding as to what harassment is, and then to develop HR policies around harassment within newsrooms as sort of a cornerstone in making it possible for women to understand and then have recourse. So for example, in Egypt, we've just had a positive development where a law was passed which would sentence a man up to 7 years for any form of sexual harassment. But you have this law up in a void, and then if you look at workplaces and newsrooms the same, there is nothing within the job policies or the HR structure that actually makes a connect between both. And so all the cases and incidents that we know of with regards to sexual harassment go unreported because people don't know, is it? And if it is, how do I take it that next step within my newsroom? And then possibly, how do I connect that to possible legal recourse? So making those connections by working within news places to create those structures, those institutional structures, because it is true that there are the more vulnerable, but we assume that within newsrooms, women are safe and that newsrooms are actually taking active measures to protect women journalists. And this is really not the case. And I don't think that MENA is singular in that. I think that you'll find this across the board. And so more action needs to be taken into creating that no woman should have to walk this, no professional journalist should have to walk this on her own. Her newsroom should be definitely in front of her and behind her every step of the way, because it is unacceptable, not just for her, but for our business.
Yeah. Part of the things that Press Forward is doing is looking at culture assessments as well. And in fact, today in Washington, we've been asked to, some of my colleagues have gone into a national newsroom to spend the day there doing a culture assessment with some experts and Pointer Institute to come away with a feedback of how the newsroom is handling these issues. So I think part of this discussion is getting these initiatives and conversations and guidelines and training programs going. I spoke to Dr. Keltner, who's a University of Berkeley professor who's studied abuse of power for many years. And one of the things he says is that the more hierarchical a society, the more prevalence there will be of violence against women, that it is a structural inequality. The more that is in existence, that you see this problem. And I just wanted to ask the panelists whether you see, there's so many different reasons that you look at in trying to understand the problem. You need to understand where it comes from. And if you have any thoughts on whether the newsroom is unique, we're seeing it's across industries. But we do have unique issues with the newsroom that I think is particular, that encourages some of this behavior. And just wanted to hear your thoughts on whether it's an environmental or if it's country by country, or if we have any sort of explanations as to some of this behavior or why it happens. Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Go ahead,
Sure.
Jules.
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
I think there is something special, if we can describe it that way, that women experience as journalists. We dare to speak truth to power as women. In Rana's case, she dares to be a Muslim woman speaking truth to power in a non-Muslim country. So we experience this onslaught partly because we're viewed as such impertinent upstarts, and especially if we're doing the kind of journalism that is not traditionally considered to be the journalistic place for women. In our industry, that's still a thing, So I think that we see ourselves being used as political footballs, as targets, particularly, as I said, in the context of disinformation, and the ways in which we're seeing that crisis upset democracy. Women are very much targeted, and women journalists become especially targeted.
Yeah.
So I think that's worth highlighting.
Yeah, I'm glad Jules mentioned the fact that I'm a Muslim, because my country has suddenly discovered that I'm a Muslim. And that really adds to a lot of love that I get in my country from the Hindu majoritarian people, because also news channels, when they call me on their debates these days, so normally they call me to debate on political stuff and etc. But these days they call me on interesting issues like triple talaq. I've not been married and I've not been divorced, so I don't know why would I want to be discussing that. But because I'm a Muslim, so I need to discuss that. About Muslim issues. About women, when we do journalism, I remember I went undercover for 8 months to do a sting operation on the present regime, on our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi. And when I come back, the book is a damning indictment of the present dispensation. And it has stinging revelations. And a lot of people said, at events, what, Rana could have been able to do that sting operation because, she was 26. And, with a good-looking woman, you don't even need a sting camera. Men start speaking as it is. This is how you kind of undermine the work of women journalists. Everything related to you is about your body, and a 26-year-old woman goes undercover for 8 months with 7 cameras on her, lives that life in the most disastrous psychological circumstances. But all you can think of, pretty little girl going in front of bureaucrats, cops, doing a sting operation on them, they would have as it is spoken. It is inherent in us. It is inherent. It is including in our media system, and we can't take that away. More so in a country like India and countries in Asia, where this patriarchy is kind of internalized. and there's not much that you can do about it. And the patriarchy coupled with the fact in a country like mine where being a woman, a Muslim woman, a woman with an opinion, a woman with investigative journalist, and a woman who speaks proudly against a dispensation, that's too many tags to wear. And I think I'll continue to wear these for some time to come.
Yeah. So I think we should open this up to questions for whomever might have some questions for us. I would love to poll the audience very quickly while we're getting microphones to people. Just by raising hands here, how many people in this audience have been impacted by sexual harassment or abuse in the workplace? If you raise your hand. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And can I ask also, how many here, when it happened, did you know what to do about it? Did you know who to go to? Did you know who to talk to? Did you know what your rights were? Yeah. It's a difficult situation. So do we have questions?
Hello. Thank you so much for this amazing discussion. My name is Delphine Algan Mishra, and I work for Reporters Without Borders for the last 6 years. And I asked many times to have official meetings with the Indian government in the last 2 years to discuss the decline of press freedom. And our meeting requests were always refused.
I'm not surprised.
So I want to go back to one point you said. You have an amazing international support, and that's really great, but that's not enough. Statements are not enough. And you said it doesn't change the situation on the ground. So how can this international support could help to change the situation on the ground? What should international press freedom organization, international media do on the ground to really help and change your situation?
Consolidate the voices to begin with. I mean, you cannot work in isolation. RSF and Reporters Without Borders cannot work in isolation. A number of organizations should come in. In my case, we got the UN Special Rapporteurs because 5 international organizations wrote to the UN at the same time. That explains how that can have an impact. Second, also understand that I am a journalist from Bombay, Delhi, a very cosmopolitan setup, right? But there are journalists in rural areas in India who do not even have the voice that I have. I enjoy a social media presence. I have access to the UN so people hear my story. I can write an op-ed in the New York Times and people read it. But what about hundreds of journalists in rural areas in India who do not even have the basic access of the internet? So I think we need to understand the problems to begin with before reaching out and asking them to leave the country. There are many issues that need to be understood and worked on.
Yeah. Over here.
Hello, I'm Anna from Brazil. I'm the founder of a startup called Women Friendly, and we work coaching executives and corporate executives how to identify, intervene, and mediate cases of sexual harassment inside corporations. I'm a reporter as well, and I have been sexual harassed like most of us. My question is, in Brazil right now, we have a polarized political scenario, as most of the countries. But tracking the conversations on Facebook, we found that feminism, and including sexual harassment, is included like what we say left-wing party conversations. So my question is, how do we leave this bubble and engage those women who are not aligned with this political view? How do, for the best interest of us, our women, as women, this should not be a political issue, should not be aligned to any party, but be a cause that every one of us should be engaged. So as a reporter, how do we start conversations with people that are outside this bubble?
That's a good question. Anybody want to take
The sound was a bit, the question was?
Just repeat it.
So,
Yeah.
It's how to start the conversation beyond technology. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. What happens is pretty much like when we invite people to debate the thematic feminism and also sexual harassment, normally we only talk with those who are aligned to left-wing parties, right? Because this is being used as a political, it's being used for the best sake of the political debate.
So how do we popularize broadly the issues?
How do we leave this bubble and engage
Okay.
other women who are not necessarily aligned to
Sure.
left-wing parties?
Go ahead. I mean, I'll just say one thing that we didn't talk about, but it might play a little bit into what you're saying, I think, which is my group started after the Matt Lauer and Charlie Rose and Mark Halperins in the US were all ousted. But we started because of Facebook and WhatsApp, because none of us had a voice. So there's this technology as a double-edged sword. in that we would never have found each other. I live in London, everybody else is all over the US and in Africa, and we found each other because of Facebook and WhatsApp, and me too, me too, me too, oh, you too, you have a story, you have a story, everybody had a story. So it was the good side of technology that actually brought us together. We know there's the bad side as well, but I'm not sure if that was the...
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, one point to follow on from there is that the platforms, we need to push the platforms to take responsibility for a problem that is largely occurring in the sense of online harassment. I think that's part of the agenda, and I've written about that. Maria Ressa has written about that. Others have written about that. But to your point, how do we actually get broad understanding, broad activism beyond the circles of journalism and beyond, say, left-aligned politics, where there is this sort of, determination on behalf of women and for press freedom? And I think the best way we can do that is to do what journalists do when they do it well, and that's to tell human stories.
Yeah.
I mean, you've heard Rana here. Maria has her own. Ferial has hers. We all have our stories. So I think storytelling becomes fundamentally important. Empathy, you can engender empathy through audiences, even hostile audiences, if you're able to do that. And Bertrand is winding us up.
Yeah, yeah. Go
But
ahead.
I just wanted to add to that as well that the offline component is also very important. What women in women journalists lack is network. Men have the coffee shop, they have all of those spaces, the public spaces where they can populate easily and they create strong networks. Women are isolated often and they don't have access to the same types of networks. So creating networks, creating spaces for women where they can come together and also become a force offline as well is something that's important to counter the power that you find within men.
We have power in numbers. We have power in our voices. And I think that's it. I want to thank you all for coming and listening. And thank you to the panel. Yeah.
Thanks for staying.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you.